Hi, welcome to Left of the Law. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the topic of Brexit. It's important for us to have a look at and assess the impacts and effects that Brexit has had on the UK economy and how this has affected businesses, individuals, and groups of people within our political system. To begin, I feel as though it's important to look at the rhetoric that was being pushed as the 2016 EU referendum was fast approaching and how this compares to the experts of Brexit, as they call themselves, and then looking at the UK economy in current times in comparison to previous measures. Now, the result of the referendum was 52% to leave the EU and 48% to remain. So it was a major democratic deficit in that, essentially 52% voted to leave, and obviously that amassed the most votes and had the highest percentage of vote share, but this leaves 48%, which is essentially half of the nation, unrepresented and not being a part of a trading bloc. That's very undemocratic. So that's an issue in itself. However, it's important for me to tackle the rhetoric that was being pushed as the 2016 EU referendum was fast approaching. So just to provide a bit of background, David Cameron was Prime Minister at the time. This wasn't a coalition government. The coalition government ended in 2015. Now, David Cameron himself wasn't at all in favour of Brexit. However, it fell upon him, as he says, to take it to the country and ask if Brexit is something that the whole country wanted. Now, he himself said that if Brexit was to be, if the nation was to vote that they wanted to leave, he would step down as Prime Minister, and so he did. We then had Theresa May for the next 2 years, up until 2019. And then we had Boris Johnson. Now, during Theresa May's tenureship, she wasn't able to push for Brexit. She wasn't able to deliver Brexit. She had a bit of bureaucracy issues. She was even taken to court by a lawyer at one point. So it was a failure. Her whole tenureship was a failure. Went on to Boris Johnson, who won the 2019 election, promised to get Brexit done. He did get Brexit done, which you can all give credit for. Despite you disagreeing, he got it done. And now we're living in the cesspit and the pains and the consequences of such a terrible unanimous decision. Now, on the back of Brexit, or the 2016 referendum vote, there were two figures. I'd say one at the time. There were two figures who were very much staunch Brexiteers. So that would obviously be Nigel Farage and Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Conservative politician, and Farage, the then UKIP politician. Now, Nigel Farage in particular ran the poster, or ran the propaganda or message that the issue with the UK's stagnant growth, the issue with wages not going up in accordance with the whole of Europe and the whole of the world, is because of immigration. Now, he put out a poster saying, and he quoted in this poster, what at a breaking point, right? The EU has failed us all, and as a result, what we need to do is leave the European Union in search for our own destiny. Now, in this, you could argue that his rhetoric throughout was very much far right. I would definitely argue that. And if you look at the picture that I've included at the back, what you do see is Nigel Farage, of course, standing behind his poster, breaking point, the EU has failed us all. And he's standing behind what seems to be entering migrants. Now, to me, as a human, when I see that, it's very, very heartbreaking. Someone who is insanely privileged, privately educated up until the point the age of 18, who hasn't had to deal with, any humanitarian crisis during his life, personally, not being able to understand or sympathize or empathize with the struggles that people face, from their motherland countries or nations, and being able to exercise compassion. Because at the end of the day, the UK is one of the most wealthiest countries, and it's seen to be, as they call it, one of the most compassionate countries. Now, the whole Brexit saga suggested otherwise. In my view, you had people like Nigel Farage who pushed the rhetoric that the reason why the UK is stagnant is because of massive diversity. It's because of these people stealing our jobs, these people stealing our school places, our university places. All of that being complete and utter rubbish. And I will prove that with statistics and facts, but I think it's important to highlight that this was what was being pushed, and it was very, very impactful, and it was very effective at the end, because Brexit was delivered and he's seen as one of the spearheads behind it. But it was very impactful because the UK was at the back of course, as I mentioned before, stagnant growth, low wages, and as well as the financial crash in 2008. So the UK hadn't recovered much post financial crash, so it took maybe around, I'd say, 4 years for the UK to start to steady up a bit. Now, during that time, obviously that's part of the reason why wages weren't able to rise per se, and he was essentially seen to the British public, or the 52% who voted for Brexit, as the next alternative, or the route for salvation for the country, which we obviously we've seen now as complete rubbish. Now we move on to Jacob Rees-Mogg, again another person or another individual who has been mired in privilege his whole life. And I'm not saying that being in privilege completely alienates you from social issues or surrounding problems. That's not what I'm saying. But I think it's very interesting that the people who are the spearheads, the figureheads of these movements, are from a certain group or elite within certain fabrics of this country. Now, you may be thinking that, why am I not mentioning Boris Johnson? He's obviously part of that fabric. He's a part of that group. But I think if you understand politics, if you know and have been following politics for quite a while, you'd know that Boris Johnson himself wasn't or isn't a staunch Brexiteer. He hasn't been. At one point during his tenureship, I think he was a politician at this time. I think around about 2017, maybe earlier. He wasn't Mayor of London at this time. I'm pretty sure he wrote 2 articles. One of which being published. The one that was published was the Brexit article. And the fact that someone can write 2 articles, one for Brexit and one against Brexit, and hearing anecdotes from people around him saying that he isn't a Brexiteer, he isn't a natural Brexiteer, it's very, very interesting, and it's very astonishing. And it does show and does shed light on the issues with politics, modern day politics, and it does show that essentially politics now has become an opportunist arena for people to drive their agendas. Moving on to Rees-Mogg, now his perspective on Brexit was that Brexit would essentially remove all forms of bureaucracy. If you don't know what bureaucracy is, documentation and the things that slow down sale of goods and stuff, so red tape and legal disputes and so forth. So he argued that the cutting of bureaucracy would mean that this would enhance business trade, this will lead and drive economic growth, all sounding very nice in theory. However, in practice, we have seen that this hasn't really come to pass. What we have seen rather is more red tape, more bureaucracy, more import fees, and so forth. So another thing that was pushed by Rees-Mogg was the freedom from EU laws, being able to have sovereignty over your own nation state, which to one can sound understandable. However, the means through which to achieve this has been, well, to me, is questionable, right? So that's the start. Those are the stances of Rees-Mogg and Farage. Those two have been known as staunch Brexiteers. Rees-Mogg has been recently called upon for answers. He's been questioned heavily by individuals, members of the public, by politicians, of opposition politicians, politicians within his own party. And I think it's very interesting with Rees-Mogg in particular. What I personally find particularly interesting is the fact that Jacob Rees-Mogg is actually benefiting massively from Brexit, and he has been paid dividends from Brexit coming into effect in 2019. And so in 2009, along with a friend, Jacob Rees-Mogg started a company called Somerset Capital Management. And essentially, just a bit of a background on the company: they invest in other companies. They invest in fields of entrepreneurship, particularly investing in global companies such as China. So they put their money into domestic and global companies and businesses. And in this, Jacob Rees-Mogg, according to reports, actually accumulated around £7 million as a result of Brexit coming into effect. Now, the reason he was able to do this is because he is investing in global markets. Right after Brexit was unveiled by Boris Johnson, or around about the period where the pound crashed heavily, Rees-Mogg was able to amass large amounts of profit as a result of that. The company as a whole made around £42 million, but he himself, as a 15% shareholder in the company, amassed £7 million. Now, of course, astonishing amount of money, but it's very, very interesting that this is the same individual that is pushing the rhetoric that Brexit is, the desired future for the country. But at the same time, he's able to amass benefits that are, of course, not even close to being achievable by, I'd say, 99.9% of the rest of the country. Brexit has benefited a small few, and it continues to benefit a small few, but we haven't yet seen, we won't see, we won't, probably won't, we haven't seen the trickle down that these individuals have called for or have said will happen, right? So Crispin Odey, someone who has come into recent light with his connections with Kwesi Kwarteng, Crispin Odey, who, again, another Brexiteer, another person who has a rich and insanely rich upbringing. He himself made around £200 million by betting that the pound would depreciate and absolutely crash. And these people, Rees-Mogg, of course, it's understandable, right? Someone who's a Thatcherite by nature, by birth, someone whose father, William Rees-Mogg, was another person who, repeatedly and consistently wrote books and articles on individuals being able to capitalize on recessions and capitalize on, economic downturns, and how this benefits a select few, himself included. So it's not really surprising to see this pass on to Jacob Rees-Mogg. But again, these were the people that were feeding into the propaganda and feeding essentially the propaganda, passing these messages on to the media, into outlets such as The Sun, and pushing them on to the public and the general public to consume at a point where the general public is already at a very vulnerable state. And it was a quick fix, right? And to the public, this was seen as something that they could latch onto. I say they because I wasn't able to vote at the time, but they were able to latch onto some sort of hope and something that would essentially bring them out of their current turmoil. And by that I mean wages. And I think now I'm going to get into the part where I compare this with the experts of economics and experts of politics, and see their approach, and see what they were saying during the time where Brexit was in contention, and what's happened in practice, because it's all in practice, right? We don't live in a theory. So Oliver Hart, a professor at Harvard University, he himself argued that the EU, the European Union, was the UK's closest ally. I mean, it was, because you're a part of a trading bloc with 27 other nation states, countries. Now, leaving that and trying to operate through your own means, it leads to more red tape, more bureaucracy, more regulation, things like that. Not only do they harm businesses, they harm importing and exporting, of course, but they also cause a lot of issues for us as consumers, daily consumers of products and goods and services, particularly goods, of course. I'm not even able to buy a shoe worth above £100, because if I do go over the £100 or £110 limit, then I do have to pay import fees. Now, that is crazy. That wouldn't have been able to be of existence if we were still in the European Union. And things like that, you may think it's a small thing, but things like this do and can affect day-to-day lives of normal working people. Now, Oliver Hart, as I said, the professor at Harvard University, that's just one example, right? I will bring another example. Mark Carney, former Chancellor of the Bank of England. He also has argued very staunchly. He argued that the UK will see, if Brexit was to pan out, the UK will see a sharp decline in GDP growth. I mean, that has happened. We can't sit here and say that hasn't happened. It has happened. Out of the whole G7, the UK has seen the sharpest decline in GDP. We haven't even been able to recover in terms of GDP since COVID. We're currently sitting at minus 0.4%. Now, me personally, I don't really like to use GDP as a sole measure of economic performance. I do prefer I'd rather look at economic performance in terms of business growth, or in terms of individual satisfaction and individual individual wages going up. I think that's a better indicator of economic growth, or seeing that things like income inequality, which I will be discussing in another video, comes down and reaches a very low point. That those to me are better metrics of economic growth. Now, aside from the experts and what they have said about Brexit, and having one of the former chancellors of the Bank of England, he was a relatively successful chancellor, have his perspective on Brexit and the whole saga and the whole phenomena is important to understand, and it's important to appreciate, because this is someone who is in the field of economics and who does understand the ins and outs, and I think that's something that the public in 2016 failed to understand, that politicians at the end of the day have an agenda to push, and under any circumstance they will essentially push that agenda. Now, academics working and operating within confinements of universities do not have agendas to push, or they might, but you're less likely to get that perspective from professors or experts within certain fields than you are politicians who are elected on the basis of their performance. Now, if a constituency has a high demand for Brexit, but the politician that serves that constituency has a different economic ideology and believes in a differing view than his constituents, then he has an obligation. He or she has an obligation to abide by his constituents, despite he or she not actually agreeing with that economic perspective. Now, I think that's something people didn't take into consideration. People rather were fed by the media, and they were fed by these politicians who are a part of the media, some of whom are a part of the media, and they drive the media propaganda. I think it's not as easy as me saying that people should have done their due diligence by reading into certain fields. Of course, it's not that simple, and at the end of the day, these issues aren't to many, these issues aren't really that deep. And by that, I mean people don't have the time of day, especially people who are working so many hours in one day. They've got so many kids to look after. They don't have, the time of day to, read a whole essay or a whole article written by a professor or written by an economist. So I think that's another thing that is important that I think I need to understand. And that's why, channels like this will push the narrative in such a concise manner for the public to understand. And every single thing mentioned here is backed by facts and stats. It's not, obviously you have got my perspective, but it's mainly driven by things that the media aren't really telling you as an audience, you as a member of public. Now, one of the motives behind the Brexit vote was immigration. So people thought immigration would be controlled. There would be less, essentially, immigrants entering the UK illegally. But this hasn't really shut the lid for immigration. And this is what this has instead led to is an uncontrolled borders, an issue with our Home Office, and essentially a very, very inadequate immigration policy and system. So latest Home Office figures actually show that the number of work, student and other visas provided to people within and outside of the European Union has increased by 83%. And this has put numbers, or the individuals, just to put that into to a figure, that is 1.1 million people that have entered the UK post-Brexit as of today through visas and work visas. Now, as someone who is a very much pro-immigration, as I know the economic benefits that this brings to a country, this is a kick in the teeth for some of the people who have voted for Brexit. They thought this issue, or the problem that the country is having, is that there is too many people and there are too many people working, when economics suggests that more people working, more people who are economically active could actually, or does actually, boost economic growth. It increases the multiplier, and things like this allow people to continue to spend, and it keeps money flowing within the economy, right? Now, this hasn't had that effect as of yet. This hasn't happened. So we haven't seen economic growth thus far. What we have seen actually is minus 0.4% decline in GDP. As I said, I'm not really a particular fan of GDP as a measure, but this is what figures prove and suggest. Now, another thing to mention is that non-visa immigration stats have also increased as a result of, I wouldn't say as a result of Brexit, but post-Brexit. So you could argue that it is as a result of Brexit. Now, visa applications, visa entrants and non-visa entrants have both increased post-Brexit. Now, we've also seen more people trying to flee war-led countries, war-stricken countries. We have seen, of course, the Ukraine war, and we have seen a lot of people from Ukraine entering the UK as a result of that conflict. We've also seen people from Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and other countries also entering the UK, because they know that the UK, or they think the UK is a safe haven. It should be a safe haven for these people to arrive and to reside in, because of the ease of resources that are currently present in the United Kingdom. However, the rhetoric that's been pushed around, or the current idea that immigrants are the issue, has actually caused, or could have been you could argue has actually caused the UK to lead itself into decline, because not only do these people bring a breadth of culture, they bring a breadth of differentiation to our current group of diverse people in this country, but they also bring a different way of life, a different perspective, a different way of working, a different way of operating, and this actually contributes massively to this contributes to the country, whether we like it or not. It contributes to development. It contributes to economic growth, as is many people's most important attribute for a country. And I think it isn't an issue for people to enter the United Kingdom through these means and for these reasons. I think that is one of the rhetorics that has been pushed massively by Nigel Farage in particular, and I think that has really not only did it increase the speed at which Brexit was delivered, but it also increased the likes of xenophobia, it increased the likes of racism, and I think these two issues in particular, aside from Brexit, are massive issues systemically that need to be tackled. So I think Brexit hasn't helped in that sense, and there are many academics from a wide breadth of universities that have looked into these two issues and have looked at the social divisions that have happened because of far right activists and far right politicians pushing the narrative of Brexit. Another thing I think is worth looking at is tax. Now, another propaganda message that was pushed by these activists and politicians was that in order to achieve high growth, we will have low taxes, and as a result of low taxes, this means that lower prices for consumers and so forth, leading to economic growth, of course, as they argue. But we have seen an increase in general taxes across Europe. So in 2000, actually, the tax levied to GDP percentage was just around about 30%. So this was within the reach of the likes of Germany, Spain, France, and so forth. Now, as you look at present figures and present statistics, the rate is around 40 to 41%. So taxes generally have actually increased, but wages haven't increased from the period of 2000 and so forth up until 2022. So there is a bit of an issue because working people are paying more tax, but their incomes aren't actually going up. Now, an issue that I'm very passionate about is income inequality. And I think one of the ways to eradicate income inequality, and this will be, of course, a separate video, but briefly, and one of the ways to eradicate income inequality is by having a progressive, we do have a progressive tax system, but a tax system that is not so rigid and not so, confined to one way of operating. We need to have a tax system that is fair, a tax system that operates and taxes efficiently and effectively. By that I mean not being able to avoid taxes by loopholes and tax havens. And I think the proportion of spending when it comes to people on lower to middle incomes, they spend more of their income. So I think that needs to be in consideration when tax policies are in consideration. Of course, I believe those at the top need to pay most tax. And I think one of the ways to eradicate income inequality is not by increasing taxes for ordinary working people. And that is what Jeremy Hunt announced in his recent budget. And that's what we have seen. Rishi Sunak even announced it for his last budget as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Liz Truss also announced massive tax cuts for those at the top, those earning above £120,000 a year. Now, things like that are in turn regressive. These policies perpetuate and they create an issue of income inequality, and they worsen income inequality. And the UK's income inequality as of recent has been worsening. So I think taxes need to be at the forefront of politicians' minds. I think Labour need to adopt something on the lines of a very, very effective way to eradicate income inequality through the use of the tax system. If they are able to, develop something of that nature, then I'll be a massive backer of that plan or that idea. Looking at industries in particular that have faced the consequences of Brexit being delivered. Last week, I think it was Thursday, I was watching BBC Question Time, as I always do every week, and there was an individual, a gentleman who was on the TV who, complained to Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was on the panel, one of the members on the panel, that the reason for his stagnation in his business is because, there's more bureaucracy, there's more red tape, there's more import fees, and he isn't able to trade. I think he's if I can remember properly, he's a wine producer. He isn't able to operate, smoothly with his European counterparts because Brexit has actually caused a distance, or it's created a bit of a wedge between European and British producers of goods and services. Now, in terms of services, the British financial sector has also taken a hit, but just looking at goods for the time being, we have seen, and we are seeing more anecdotes from individuals or groups and businesses who complaining about Brexit and the effects that their businesses are having as a result of Brexit. Now, just looking at the automotive sector, Toyota in particular have actually seen a decline in their profits. They've seen a decline in their services because they aren't able to transfer and to ease the barriers to trade with their European counterparts. Because, when you're in the regional trading bloc of the European Union, you have essentially the EU has more than 1 billion customers, and when you have such a regional operation such as the European Union, you are able to find buyers for your goods and services. You are able to find buyers for your products. It does mean competition is fierce, but you have a much bigger market to work with, as opposed to just trading on your own and trading with Australia, New Zealand, like the UK is trying to push. 77% of cars produced, of which 58% went to the European Union as an export. These figures have declined. 77% of cars that are produced in the United Kingdom, and of that 77%, 58% of them were exported to the European Union. This stat has obviously fallen, and obviously with that stat falling, it has led to car producers having to operate with higher costs, having to operate with new buyers, which could seem as a good thing. It can be seen as a good thing, but the market that they're familiar with has been taken away from them, or has been harder to access, and that is an issue that needs to be looked at. As I mentioned, Toyota are a particular anecdote or particular company that have raised this issue. Now, looking at airlines, another industry that is very, very close to many people, because people are always traveling. Visas have become something to be in consideration for if you are traveling to a European country. Now, let's say, there's something called the Schengen visa now that you need with certain European countries, Portugal and Spain being two of them that I know from the top of my head. Now, these visas, you need to pay large amounts of fees to acquire these visas, like having to pay additional costs on travel for visas. It's bad enough having to pay, visa prices to go to your motherland countries, but let alone the European Union, European countries that were so closely connected. So Schengen visa has been an issue. 20% of EasyJet's profits have actually fallen. Not profits, sorry. Share price. They've seen their share prices drop as a result of the European Union. The airline industry is something that most of us have experienced, and we know can be very daunting at times. And if you're doing transit travels, going to another country and stopping at that country for a certain amount of time and then going to another country. It can be hectic. It is very hectic. So, things like visas do create additional bureaucracy, additional red tape, and that can be annoying. Now, the farming industry is something that I think every single person in this country is a recipient of, right? We all eat fruits and vegetables, whether on a daily basis, I'm not sure. But we all eat fruits and vegetables. We all eat eggs and chickens and so forth. We all eat, many of us eat meat, aside from vegans. But, milk prices have gone up in the UK. Egg prices have gone up. Eggs are becoming more scarce. They're becoming more limited. Milk has also become a bit more scarce, not as scarce as eggs, but eggs are becoming more scarce. And shortages of fruits and vegetables, and as a result of these shortages, what we're seeing in supermarkets, what I have seen in supermarkets is, like, for instance, if I was to buy chilies, for example, compared to perhaps if I bought chilies, I'm not sure, maybe at the start of the year, in January time, or perhaps last year period, because I'm an avid consumer of chilies. If I was to buy these chilies, these chilies will be normal length size, about maybe six centimeters. Now if I buy these chilies are insanely small. These chilies are about maybe 1 to 2 centimeters. Now this is because of, not only because of harvest issues, but because it's very, very difficult to import these chilies that are coming from foreign countries into the UK because of additional bureaucracy. Some of these chilies are coming from, of course, countries outside of the EU, but most of them are coming from countries within the European Union, and this again creates another added issue for us as consumers on a daily basis. Now, these three industries, the automotive sector, the airline sector, and the farming sector, are something that we all have connection to one way or another. And I think the issue of Brexit has meant that these industries have seen a decline in their operations, and they have to find new ways to innovate. Now, from an economic perspective, aside from the economic downturns that these industries are seeing, one could argue that this allows them to diversify. It allows them to find new recipients within markets, and find new customers, and find new ways to operate in accordance with other countries. It can be effective, definitely. But when you're in a cost of living crisis, when you are not able to live within your means, with things like this, things, particularly farming, because, this is something that we're all recipients of, as I mentioned, with things like this, it adds an additional sense of baggage on your shoulders. Now, overall, we have seen arguments put forward that Brexit has been, quite frankly, ineffective. And as a result, these issues that I have mentioned in this episode need to be at the forefront of our politicians' minds, and they have to be the ones to essentially correct these issues. I think it's also good to mention that the pound has been tanking recently, but aside from that, Brexit is something that can be worked on. It can be reformed. I mean, if I had the choice now, if I was able to vote, which I am able to vote now, but if I was able to vote right now, I would definitely vote to remain, because of the economic benefits and the social benefits, as well as the economic benefits from being in a regional group. There are so many things that we have access to by being in the European Union, and taking that away from many of us, 48% of us, quite frankly, is a democratic issue. Not only that comes under the issue of referendums, and referendums being an issue in themselves. You can look back at the 2014 Scottish referendum that also had another democratic deficit. But aside from referendums, Brexit has been ineffective, quite frankly, and I think it's important for us, those who have or did voted for Brexit, to understand where they went wrong and to reconcile with themselves, and not to push the narrative that, because of the global crisis of which we are currently living in, every single nation state or every single country across the globe is also experiencing similar issues. Not entirely true, because UK in particular are facing, not only are we facing large amounts of inflation, which is also paramount to other countries within the EU as well, I have to admit that, but we are the only nation in the G7, we're the only nation in Europe with negative growth. Now, that can't be thrown under the rug. It needs to be something that is on the forefront of everyone's minds. And I think we need to understand that the economic downsides of leaving the EU are and have and will continue to cost us. As a result, we should probably try and find a solution. But this, again, is in the hands of the politicians. And these politicians are essentially the ones who need to get elected and re-elected. I think most people want to re-enter the EU. A lot of people have actually been calling for us to re-enter the EU, and I think you could maybe make a case that it's too late. You could also make a case that I think it should happen because the current circumstances we're finding ourselves in aren't really sustainable, and so forth. I think what we should do instead is, put forward these arguments and put forward these ideas that, this event in history that will go down in probably one of the worst, democratic decisions in history. This issue in particular has had such a detrimental effect to not only the progress of the UK, but to the potential of the UK, and it has actually impacted, working people massively, whilst also filling the pockets of the rich. I gave you guys examples: Crispin Odey, Jacob Rees-Mogg, both of whom accumulated large amounts of wealth, and there are many others, because there are people in this world, or people within certain demographics that are betting essentially on the failure of the UK and betting against the pound and so forth, and they are able to profit off of these events. And as a result of that, they are essentially the kingpins who run the media outlets. They run, I'm not saying Rees-Mogg of course, but people like, you can argue Rupert Murdoch and so forth. You can argue Crispin Odey, who has agendas to push. These people are the same individuals who are rather skewing people's minds away from actual issues that Brexit is associated with, which is economics, and mainly economics, I'd say. They're pushing onto immigration, and they're pushing onto the issue that the reason why you don't have higher wages is because of someone else is taking your job, and because that person is taking your job, you're not able to get another job, which has caused an issue, and now we need to vote for something to stop that issue. Complete myth. But anyways, if you did enjoy this video, please be sure to leave a like. Any comments or any views you have on this video, please be sure to leave them in the comment section below. I'll be happy to respond to any comments. This is, at the end of the day, this is a platform for discussion, as I mentioned in my introduction video. So I'll be happy, and I am happy to respond to any comments, any sources or any used information that I've used in this video to supplement this video with facts and information. I will be sure to leave those things in the comments, in the description box down below for you to check out if you wish, or if you please. Merry Christmas, and I wish you all a happy